He was just my co-pilot. Another routine flight. Another layover in a faraway place. But that night, after the storm, something changed. Something I never expected and couldn't ignore. The descent was smooth, almost deceptively so, given what had preceded it. Rain had lashed against the cockpit windows just an hour ago, turbulence rocking the aircraft with unpredictable fury. But now, as the wheels touched down on the glistening tarmac of a tropical island's small airport, there was a sense of stillness that settled into the cabin like a sigh of relief. Captain Chris Monroe had flown through countless storms in his 20 years at the helm, but this one had left a mark. Not because it had been the worst, but because of the silence that had passed between him and the man seated to his right. Jake Lawson, his first officer, had sat there focused, composed, hands steady on the controls, jaw clenched not with fear, but with something quieter, deeper. They had flown together a few times before, long-haul routes across the Atlantic, early morning departures over misty northern coasts. Always professional, always distant, just enough small talk to pass time, but never more than required. Yet tonight, something had shifted. In the quiet of that storm, between the brief exchanges and alert acknowledgments, Chris had felt a presence, not just beside him, but beneath his skin. The tropical air was thick as they exited the aircraft. The passengers had disembarked into the steamy evening, and the ground crew moved quickly, unloading luggage and prepping the plane for its short overnight rest. Chris lingered on the tarmac for a moment, eyes lifted toward a clearing sky. The storm had passed, but its energy still lingered. Jake walked past him, his flight bag slung over his shoulder, gaze unreadable. They didn't speak, only exchanged a glance, brief, flickering. Then they boarded the shuttle to the nearby hotel arranged by the airline. The ride was quiet. Dim lights from the small island town glowed through the foggy windows. Chris watched Jake from the corner of his eye, his profile sharp, thoughtful, almost tired. But it wasn't exhaustion from the flight. It was the kind of weariness one carried when something remained unspoken for too long. Their hotel stood near the edge of a cliff overlooking the sea. The reception was quick, room keys handed over with polite smiles and clipped efficiency. Chris ended up in a room just down the hall from Jake's, not by request, but by the randomness of hotel logistics. He stood in his room for a moment, letting the quiet press in. The room smelled faintly of sea salt and wood polish. Through the balcony doors, the ocean murmured under a night sky, still wet from the storm. Chris loosened his tie, unbuttoned his collar, and stepped out onto the balcony, letting the wind touch his face. It felt like exhaling after holding his breath all day. Down below, the hotel's pool shimmered under warm lights. Empty now, save for a few fallen palm leaves drifting like forgotten memories. Somewhere in the distance, music played, soft, rhythmic, the pulse of the island's nightlife just beginning to stir. He didn't expect to see Jake again that evening. But as Chris turned his head, he noticed movement on the balcony 2 doors down. A silhouette leaning against the railing, motionless. It was Jake. The glow from his room cast a gentle light behind him, outlining the curve of his shoulders, the stillness of his posture. They stood like that for a while, separate, yet connected by proximity and something else, something less tangible. Chris didn't call out. He didn't wave. He just stood there, eyes on the sea, aware of Jake in the same way one is aware of the moon overhead. Present, silent, magnetic. He thought about the flight, the way Jake's hand had steadied the throttle during a sudden drop, the calmness in his voice when he reported the altitude deviation, the way their eyes had met for just a second too long after touchdown. Not unusual for a crew to form a bond during a difficult flight, but this had felt different, not forged in fear, but in awareness. The wind picked up slightly, carrying the scent of rain-drenched earth and distant jasmine. Chris closed his eyes for a moment, listening, not to the music, not to the ocean, but to something inside himself, a quiet pulse that had been there longer than he cared to admit. When he opened them again, Jake was gone from the balcony. Chris lingered a moment longer before stepping back inside. He closed the door gently, locking out the wind, but not the thoughts it had stirred. He didn't sleep immediately. Instead, he sat on the edge of the bed, barefoot, elbows on knees, mind replaying moments that shouldn't have mattered but did. A hand on a lever, a glance that lingered, a breath shared in silence. The storm had passed, but something had shifted. Morning arrived slowly, with golden light filtering through linen curtains that swayed in the breeze. The storm from the night before had left no visible trace, only a kind of freshness in the air, as though the island had been scrubbed clean and left glistening under the new sun. From his balcony, Captain Chris Monroe watched the sea roll gently against the rocks below. The horizon looked endless, blue on blue, soft and quiet. There was something about layovers in places like this that always unsettled him. The silence, the stillness, it gave space for thoughts he usually kept buried under checklists, schedules, and flight plans. He sipped his coffee slowly, letting the bitterness ground him. It was still early, and the rest of the hotel seemed asleep. Jake Lawson hadn't shown up at breakfast, at least not yet. Not that they had plans, but Chris had lingered longer than usual in the dining area, half watching the entrance, half hoping for something unspoken. He wasn't sure what he expected, a nod, a conversation, perhaps just a shared moment over coffee. But Jake hadn't come. After finishing his meal in silence, Chris took the long path around the pool, following a trail that led toward the rocky edge of the property. A narrow terrace jutted out, partially shaded by overgrown palms and flowering shrubs. It was a peaceful corner, one that felt detached from everything else. He stood there for a while, just breathing, the sun warm on his face, the sea far below whispering to the rocks. He thought again of the night before, of the silence on the balcony. The absence of words had somehow said more than a conversation might have. There had been something hanging in the air, as real as the humidity, as invisible as the wind. Chris had flown with many co-pilots over the years, some friendly, others forgettable. But Jake was different. Not in any obvious way, but in the quiet weight of his presence. A certain way he observed everything, how he took in the world without rushing to fill it with sound. As Chris turned to head back toward the hotel, he saw him, Jake, walking along the opposite path alone. He wasn't in uniform anymore, just a pale linen shirt and dark slacks, sleeves rolled up casually, sunglasses in hand. There was a quiet grace to him, a kind of tired elegance that didn't demand attention but held it nonetheless. They passed each other without words at first, only a faint nod of acknowledgement. Jake slowed, as if debating something, then turned back. "Didn't expect to run into you here," he said with a half-smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Chris offered a simple shrug, his voice measured. "Just stretching my legs." That was the extent of it. No deep conversation. No probing questions, just a moment suspended in the sunlight. Jake gave a short nod and continued walking. Chris watched him go, his footsteps light on the stone path. The rest of the day passed in fragments. A long afternoon nap, a brief swim in a near-empty pool, a call from flight operations confirming their departure time tomorrow. He filled the hours with small rituals, trying not to think too much. By evening, the island seemed to glow with soft color. The sky burned orange and pink at the edges, casting long shadows across the open veranda where guests gathered for dinner. Chris had chosen a table tucked into a corner, alone again, watching couples clink glasses and laugh under string lights that swayed in the warm breeze. And then, without warning, Jake appeared, plate in hand, eyes scanning the room before settling on Chris's table. He didn't ask. He just sat down, moving with the quiet confidence of someone who didn't need permission. Chris looked at him, surprised but calm. Jake spoke first, his tone light, but sincere. "This place is beautiful," he said, then paused. "Hard to believe we almost didn't make it in." Chris gave a small chuckle. "Yeah, storm like that. Not something you forget easily." For a moment, they just ate in silence. The clink of silverware, the rustle of palm leaves above, the distant hum of music, these became their background. There was no need to fill the space with conversation. The quiet between them had a different quality now. Not awkwardness, but recognition. When they finished, Jake leaned back in his chair, watching the horizon. "I always thought I'd get used to traveling," he said. eyes distant. But sometimes the stillness between flights hits harder than the turbulence ever does. Chris didn't reply right away. He just nodded, knowing exactly what he meant. Later, they walked back to the hotel together. Not close enough to touch, but not far enough to ignore. The path was dimly lit, lined with flowers that released their scent only after dark. Chris felt the warmth of the evening air settle on his skin, the sound of Jake's footsteps beside him strangely grounding. When they reached the hallway, Jake paused outside his door. "Well, early flight tomorrow," he said quietly, keycard in hand. Chris hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah, better rest up." Jake looked at him for a second longer than necessary. His eyes held something, curiosity, maybe, or just an echo of all the words left unsaid. Then he disappeared behind the door, and Chris was alone again. But something had changed. The hotel above the sea felt less like a layover and more like a beginning. Night returned with a softness that seemed unique to this island. A sky layered in deep indigo, air rich with the scent of wet leaves and distant ocean. After dinner, Chris had returned to his room, not out of fatigue, but because he needed space to think. Something unspoken had passed between him and Jake at that table. It had not been dramatic or sudden. No revelation, no declarations. Just presence. Mutual, quiet, unmistakable. Outside, the rain had started again, but gently this time. Not the violent kind that came with thunder, but a slow, rhythmic drizzle that tapped lightly against the roof tiles and balcony railing. Chris stood by the sliding door, watching drops bead on the glass, the world beyond blurred into watercolor. The sound of footsteps in the hallway made him turn. He didn't expect a knock, but there it was, soft, almost tentative. When he opened the door, Jake stood there, his shirt damp at the shoulders, hair darkened slightly by the rain. No words were needed. Chris simply stepped aside, and Jake entered. He carried no umbrella, no excuse for the visit. Just his quiet presence, hands in his pockets, eyes unreadable. For a long moment, they said nothing. The door clicked shut behind them, and the room seemed to absorb the stillness like a sponge. Jake walked to the balcony, slid the door open, and stepped outside. The rain hadn't let up. It wasn't strong enough to drench, but it kissed everything it touched. Chris followed, drawn more by instinct than decision. They stood side by side, leaning on the railing, eyes fixed on the sea far below. The water churned gently, a mirror of the clouds above. The light from the hotel cast a warm glow on the wet tiles, making everything shimmer with a kind of fragile magic. Chris could feel the heat radiating off Jake, despite the cool dampness in the air. There was a quiet tension between them, not sharp or awkward, more like the space before a question is asked, or just after a truth is realized. Jake tilted his head back slightly, letting the rain fall onto his face. It was a simple gesture, yet something about it felt raw, honest, like he wasn't trying to be anything other than exactly what he was in that moment. Without turning, he spoke, barely louder than the rain. "I couldn't sleep." Chris didn't respond with words. He just nodded, understanding too well the kind of restlessness that had no real cause, the kind that came from something inside that refused to be still. The minutes passed slowly. Neither of them moved, and yet everything inside Chris felt like it was shifting. The way Jake's fingers tapped lightly on the metal railing. The occasional breath that hitched in his throat. It was the most intimate silence Chris had known in years. He thought about all the layovers, all the hotel rooms, all the other pilots who had come and gone. None of them had made him feel this way. None of them had pulled his attention so fully into the present. Jake turned then, not facing him directly, but enough for their shoulders to nearly brush. The light hit his profile just right, soft shadows playing across his jaw, the small lines near his eyes visible in the glow. There was something vulnerable there, something open. Chris didn't need to ask what he was thinking. He already knew. It was the same thing that had been threading itself through their silence for days. The rain picked up slightly, falling in heavier drops. Jake's shirt clung a little tighter to his back, outlining the slope of his shoulders, the line of his spine. He didn't move away. Neither did Chris. A small sigh escaped from Jake, not of weariness, but release. as if standing there in the rain, beside someone who understood without needing explanation, was enough. As if this shared stillness was the only language they needed. Chris's hand twitched by his side, a flicker of movement he didn't act on. Not yet. He knew this wasn't about rushing toward anything. It was about being present, about offering something quiet and real in a world that rarely allowed for that. Finally, Jake looked at him. Really looked. His eyes were steady, but behind them was something fragile. Hopeful. Waiting. Chris held the gaze. There was no fear in it, only clarity. He didn't step forward. He didn't reach out. He just stayed beside him in the rain, letting the closeness speak for itself. In the end, it wasn't about the words. It was about what had passed between them in silence. When Jake finally turned back toward the sliding door, Chris followed. They didn't say goodnight. There was no need. The door closed gently behind them, the rain continuing to fall just beyond the glass. And inside, the quiet felt like something sacred. The morning was gray but warm, the kind of tropical overcast that felt like the sky was holding its breath. Chris woke early, not from an alarm, but from a restlessness that had lingered in his chest since before dawn. He didn't dream, at least not in any way he could remember, but the feeling of something unresolved clung to him like humidity. He stepped onto the balcony, coffee in hand, shirt still unbuttoned from sleep. Below, the sea moved with the same slow rhythm as the night before, but the mood had shifted. There was no rain now, just the thick silence of morning air and distant birdsong. The balcony next to his was empty. Jake's door was closed, the curtains drawn. Chris stared at it for a while, thinking about the night before, the quiet, the nearness, the electricity that had passed between them like static before a storm. There had been a moment, one small window of time, when everything could have changed. A hand extended, a word spoken, but nothing had been said. And maybe that was the only thing that made it possible to stay in that moment without shattering it. He didn't regret the silence, but it haunted him. Later that morning, they met in the hotel lobby, not by accident, but not by arrangement either. Their eyes met briefly as they approached the checkout desk. Jake offered a faint nod, and Chris returned it, both of them aware of the carefully controlled distance they were keeping. The van ride to the airport was filled with mundane conversation from other crew members and a few airline staff. Chris barely registered it. His thoughts moved in loops, returning always to that balcony, to the stillness they had shared, to the space where something had nearly been spoken aloud. At the gate, they waited for boarding clearance. Their flight wasn't due for another hour, but routine demanded early presence. Chris sat near the window, watching the sky brighten in patches. Jake sat a few rows away, headphones in, eyes closed, posture still. From the outside, it would have looked like nothing had changed. Two pilots, resting before another flight. Calm, collected, professional. But Chris could feel the current between them, stretched thin by unspoken weight. He thought about saying something, about walking over, sitting beside him, starting a conversation that would tip the balance. But something in him resisted. Fear, perhaps, not of Jake's response, but of disrupting the quiet intimacy that had begun to take root in silence. Once on board, the familiarity of the cockpit brought a strange comfort. Pre-flight checks, fuel reports, communication with ground control. It was muscle memory by now. Chris fell into it easily, his voice calm over the intercom, his focus sharp where it needed to be. Jake mirrored his professionalism. Every switch, every command, executed without hesitation. But between the tasks, in the seconds where nothing required attention, their eyes would meet. Just briefly. Just enough. During climb out, the island shrank beneath them, the coast dissolving into mist. They said nothing as they rose through scattered clouds, the sky opening wide above them. And in that ascent, something in Chris settled. Not resolved, not clarified, but steadied. Hours passed in the air. The route was long, the air smooth. When Jake stepped out of the cockpit for a break, Chris stayed behind, eyes fixed on the sky, hands steady on the yoke. He thought about the night again, about the rain on Jake's shoulders, the soft look in his eyes, the way their silence had wrapped around them like a shared understanding. He hadn't imagined it. It had been real, as real as the controls beneath his fingers. But still, he hadn't said anything. Later, after landing, they went through customs and protocol like always. Bags collected, uniforms adjusted, another layover ahead, another hotel. This time, they were placed in different wings of the building. Chris stood by the window in his new room, watching the sun set behind another stretch of foreign coastline. He had been in dozens of places like this. Hotel rooms with generic art and soft beds. Oceans that looked the same from every shore. And yet, this place felt different because of the silence that now followed him like a shadow. He hadn't spoken the words he wanted to say. He hadn't touched the hand he wanted to reach for. But maybe that was okay. Maybe it wasn't about rushing into something, but about letting it grow where it wanted to. In the spaces between, in the pauses, in the choices not made. He didn't know what Jake was thinking now. Whether he, too, sat by a window, remembering the same night. But he hoped so. And tomorrow, there would be another flight. Another chance. Another moment to choose whether to speak or stay silent. The sky was clearer than it had been in days, painted in soft pastels as dawn crept over the horizon. High above the world, inside the cockpit of a cruising aircraft, silence lingered not as absence, but as presence. Chris sat in the left seat, hands relaxed on the controls, eyes scanning the endless blue ahead. Next to him, Jake adjusted the flight display, movements precise and calm. Neither of them spoke, but there was no discomfort in the stillness. It felt earned, shared. The past few days had unfolded like a quiet unraveling. Small moments stacked atop one another, glances, pauses, gestures that meant more than they let on. There had been no dramatic declarations, no rule-breaking closeness. Just the steady rhythm of mutual awareness growing into something undeniable. Chris had thought a lot about that night on the balcony, the rain, the shared silence. He'd replayed it countless times, not because he regretted it, but because it had carved something new into the space between them. It hadn't faded with time. It had deepened. They had flown together 3 times since then, each journey different in length and route, but always with the same quiet understanding humming beneath the surface. In the confined space of the cockpit, their familiarity grew, not loud or obvious, but steady. An anchor in the sky. Today's flight was their last for a while. Scheduling changes, rotations, routes diverging. Chris had known this was coming, but the thought of parting had lodged itself somewhere behind his ribs. Not painful, but present. He glanced at Jake, who sat with a quiet ease, his profile calm against the soft glow of the morning sun. There was a strength in his stillness, something Chris had come to admire deeply. He didn't speak unless there was something worth saying. He didn't reach unless he meant it. It had become a kind of language between them. A brush of shoulders when passing in narrow hallways. A shared look when one of them caught something the other missed. The way Jake's hand had lingered a second longer than necessary while handing over a clipboard. Tiny threads. Together, they had started to form something whole. During cruise, Jake reached for his thermos, took a sip, then leaned back slightly in his seat. His gaze drifted out toward the clouds. "I always like mornings like this," he said softly, eyes still forward. "They make everything feel possible." Chris nodded, his voice quiet. "Yeah, like a clean page." That was all they said for a while. As they began their descent, the coastline appeared far ahead, etched against the water like a promise. The light shifted, painting the cockpit in golds and shadows. Chris felt the weight of transition in the air, not just from altitude, but from something more internal. A chapter closing, a threshold approaching. After landing, as the engines spooled down and the cabin crew disarmed doors, the cockpit became still. Jake began the shutdown checklist, his movements smooth, practiced. Chris followed along, each switch a small act of finality. When it was done, they sat there a moment longer than necessary. Passengers were disembarking, ground crew was waiting, but still they lingered. Jake turned to him then, not with urgency, not with hesitation, just presence. His eyes were steady, but softer than usual. Not searching, just open. "I don't know what this is yet," he said, voice barely louder than a whisper. "But I don't want it to disappear." Chris met his gaze, something warm stirring in his chest. He didn't need to ask what Jake meant. He already knew. He'd felt it too. It won't, he replied. We'll find a way. There were no promises. No sweeping gestures. Just a quiet agreement between two men who had spent their lives navigating storms, internal and external, and had finally found something worth holding on to. They walked through the terminal side by side, their bags slung over their shoulders, uniforms crisp despite the hours in the air. Around them, travelers rushed, announcements echoed, lights blinked. But inside the shared silence between them, there was calm. At the taxi stand, Jake paused, fingers wrapped around the handle of his suitcase. Chris stopped too, neither in a hurry to leave. Jake smiled, faint but sincere. I'll see you soon. Chris nodded. You will. Then Jake turned and stepped into a waiting car, disappearing into the motion of the city. Chris stood still for a moment, the air buzzing softly around him. Then he looked up. The sky was open, wide, bright. The next flight would be different. The days ahead, unknown. But he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope.